Hello, Patricia. It's Sunday, the 22nd of January, 89. Suppose I should put the year on. Since this is a tip I promised, or you asked for rather, and I promised I would send about your ancestors, and you said you would want it for your children. Well, I think this is an ideal time for sending it off. If Tootsie shuts her mouth and stops coughing. I'm coughing. I've got the cold. And your daddy isn't here. He's up helping Chris Bayliss at the shop. His wife has left him. Maybe a storm in a teacup, I don't know. So I thought to myself, well, what's the point in getting up, wandering around a house on your own? I'll probably not see your father until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Maybe earlier, maybe he'll be down for lunch. And I was lying here thinking, and it suddenly occurred to me, Isabel Rose rang this morning to see if there was any tips coming to her. So after I assured her that there was, I thought to myself, now's the time. Tootsie, will you shut your mouth? Now's the time to do the tip. And I don't know what would be the best way to tackle this. I can just give you memory and hearsay. And the hearsay is true because it would be heard over and over again. So I would say that your father's family are the more illustrious side of the family, of your family tree. And I'm more aware of his family tree than he is himself, albeit that he heard it many times. Let's see if this is tipping, because that's all I would need. That done. We'll carry on. We'll start with my father's side first. Oh, I should say, I bought a spanking brand new 60-minute tip for this. Actually, I bought 2, and your feather-headed father has used them. So this is an old one of Isabel Rose's, a 90. Patricia, if I don't get through a 90, you'll just have to suffer the rest. But I'll do my best. Starting on my father's side. My father's mother's mother. Her maiden name was Rachel Malnamoe. And she came from someplace in Armagh. I think it was Warringtown. I'm not sure. But it was a place called Malnamoe. In actual fact, when my sister Phyllis went to that parish, these Malnamoes were baptised. Now you may wonder that they were in the church records. I dare say they were all baptised Catholics then, but they were in the church records, which meant they had a shilling. They were well enough off to have a shilling to give to the priest, because quite a few children weren't baptised. And another thing too, they made it law in the mid 19th century, I think it was about 1860 or 1870, they made it law. They brought a law out that all children had to be recorded in the parish roll. Well, anyway, she's there, and her name was actually Mallon. But, so you could say she was Rachel Mallon, but they would have had owned a cow or 2, or 3 or 10, I don't know. But that's why Namo means the cow. Na is the, and Mo is cow. Namo means the cow, which means there were people who had a cow or cows, or maybe one, I don't know, Patricia. So she came to Belfast as a young girl, and I asked my father one time, why did she come to Belfast? And he said it was because he didn't know, but it was possibly up to do housework, or to be a servant girl, that's the way he put it, to be a servant girl in one of the big houses, because Belfast in those days, was a very wealthy place for the very wealthy, just like it was the same in England. You were either rich or poor, there was no in between. But anyway, she met a Tony Stewart, Anthony Stewart, and this Anthony Stewart came from a very good background, because my mother said that he always wore striped trousers, a black jacket, a top hat, and he wore spats. Now you may wonder what spats are, but if you ever see the old movies where the men wear like highly polished shoes and little covers over the tops of the shoes, they're spats. And he always carried a cane that was like something like a walking stick, but more of a cane with a little knob on it. She said, I can't remember much about it. She remembers him. Well, she met up with this Tony Stewart or Anthony Stewart, and it's S-T-U-A-R-T. And the heavens, she had 13 children from him. But times were very bad. They lived in the first house in a street that is non-existent today called Carnmoney Street. And times were very bad. Oh, Anthony Stewart worked as a clerk at the docks, which meant it was a good steady job. He must have had some sort of education. He must have been an educated man of sorts, whatever that would have meant then, to have held such a responsible job, because he was also the wages clerk, and that involved other sorts of clerking. Dare say a bookkeeper he was. But he had one terrible affliction. He was very, very fond of the liquor. Now about that Stewart side, I don't know a solitary thing about them, except Tony Stewart was a gentleman and was never ever taken off his guard to be anything other than soft-spoken and a gentleman to the fingertips, but accursed with being too fond of the booze. So, as I say, they married and had 13 children, and it was hard times bringing up 13 children, and all that. She had a yard at the back where she kept 2 or 3 pigs, or 4 or 5 pigs, I don't know what it was, but I remember seeing it was on the gable end. She had another door into this backyard, biggish door, about twice the breadth of an ordinary door. It was wooden, greeny colour, and I didn't know till a long time after she was dead they were her pigs that used to snortle through the door, because I used to tickle their nose as a wee girl. I lived in Trainfield in Artillery Street then. Well, you can see Artillery Street all the way down, and Carnmoney Street ran into Artillery Street, if you know what I mean. You know how you would have Trainfield Street was off the New Lodge Road? Well, it was something like that, but she was the end house, and she had the benefit of this yard. And I don't think she put this door in, it was already there. It was usual in those days to have a little sideline, like a few chickens or a few pigs. So that's about it. And I do remember being in her house for a few times, and people had wallpaper when I was a child. We left Artillery Street when I was 5. It would have been before we left Artillery Street that I would have been in her house with my mother. And she still whitewashed walls and scrubbed white benches and black leaded old-fashioned fireplace. And you know, the thing is, Patricia, it was a funny kind of fireplace. Nobody else had it. They all had little hobs and grates, and this was like a cradle thing. But the place was always, you know, clinically clean, immaculately clean. And she dressed long black skirt, and she used to wear like a little tiny hat on her grey cap, a little cap on her head, and she was a very tall lady, and that was verified over the years that she was very tall. It isn't just through the eyes of a child. But anyway, when she was 13, she also had a stall at the market, and this was like in between having these children, or I suppose right up to they were born and back out right and sharp. She had a stall at the market selling all sorts of things, bric-a-brac, and this was the Belfast Saturday market. It was only one day. In actual fact, I remember when I was about 6 or 7, this newspaper going round, and I couldn't read at the time except like little bits, and we only read little bits out to each other in our house. There was a big write-up, a full page on her, and photographs and everything. Rachel Stewart. I had to correct that in here. I'm playing this over again, Patricia, so I'll come back in, and it's Rachel Stewart I'm talking about. As bright and astute as a young girl, and still can give you a crack of her tongue if you were to say something. I remember all that, and they give her great praise for her attitude to life and her outlook. So, anyway, it cost £10 then for a person to go to America. Now, we're going away back to when she had the 13 children and they were all young, and it cost £10. And she gathered up the £10. Well, suppose she earned it at the market and selling her pigs, albeit she still had this squad of children round her. And you know, they were all, there was only one set of, oh God, there's our door. Who could that be? Sugar. Back in a minute. I'm not going to answer it. I'm in bed. Anyway, I'm not answering it. If it's your daddy, he's his key. So, could be Martin, or that's nuisance up the street, Leslie Warner. No. Not answering it. Oh God, there's Maggie away out to make a whole barking match. Oh, maybe I should see. I'll tell them I'm in bed with the cold. It's only a little bitsy cold, but God, it's awful hard to get people off the doorstep, isn't it? What'll I do? Oh, I'll let them in. I went to open the door, and it was Leslie Warner. God, Patricia, he's the bane of my life at the moment. An old fellow of 81. And nobody else wants him. And you know, there was one time he was coming down 3 times a day, and he's most uninteresting. David would know who he is. He was a Lord Mayor 2 years running and the High Sheriff of Worcester. But today he's yesterday's man, like I'm yesterday's woman. And we just get a bit too much of them. Sika, are you coming in or going out? Well, I forget where I was there. I suppose I should go back. Oh yes, it cost £10 to send him off to America. So she gathered up the £10, gave it to him, and he went off to New York. No, Boston. He went to Boston. And the idea was that, well, obviously, when I heard that she gave him £10, he must have been spending all the money he earned drinking. And she had this stall running at the market, plus her 13 children, plus her few pigs out the back, and she had all this to contend with. But she sent him off to Boston, and the idea was that within a year he would have sufficient money, because there was big money to be made in America then, and he would bring her and the children out, where the children travelled free passage, and you only paid £10 per adult, because America was wanting people in to inhabit the place. So he went, and she waited, and she waited, and she never got a scrap of a note from him. Not a word, no letters, nothing to say where he was, what he was doing. So after 2 years, now you remember she was living in a little kitchen house. She was blackleading the grate one morning, and it was a sunny summer's morning, and polishing away at the grate, when the first thing, there used to be an old saying, I'll throw my hat in, and if my hat stays, I can come in after it, but if I throw it out, I can go away. And the first thing, the door, the children were able to tell this. That would have been my grandmother and her sisters or whatever. And the first thing, this hat came wheeling through and landed right beside her as she polished she was blackleading the grate. She looked at the hat and never looked out, took it up and wheeled it right out through the door to him again. Got up, closed the door and put the bolt on it. There was 2 doors, you see. There was a little outside door, a little hallway, and the door into this kitchen. And she never looked round. Well, the finish of him was, he drank himself to death, and he died in the Star of the Sea men's home. Destitute he was. Died young too. Well, she went on with these 13 children, and she married, and finish her life story. She lived till she was 95, I think, or 95 or 96. And I was about 7 or 8 at the time when word came round that Granny Stewart was knocked down by a horseless carriage. As she put it, people were calling them motor cars, but she still called them horseless carriage. And you know, Patricia, many a time I wonder how tough she was. She had a broken pelvis and a broken collarbone, and she lived for 13 weeks. Well, she had these 3 layabout sons. One of them, Charlie, was married and with a wife and a child, but he lived more with the mother than with his own wife. And then there was Jimmy, and then there was Tony. And the whole 3 of them drank themselves to death, but the point is, she kept them all. But she had one hell of a task on her hands when she was rearing these children. And the task was this: she had to get those daughters married. Now, I don't know exactly how many daughters she had, but my grandmother's name was Rose. And the family were all an extremely good-looking family, because Tony Stewart was a very good-looking man, and she was reputed to be a very good-looking woman. I don't recall her good-looking, except she was very distinguished-looking. There wasn't very many like her, and she didn't move much with the times. She was like something, if you looked at it today, out of Jane Eyre or something, you know, like that sort of gear she wore. So she did what I would consider to be a cruel thing too, but then she had her problems, because like the more children you had round you, the more you had to feed. And when Rose was only 16, there was a man called Philip Doherty who came down from Derry and was lodging across the street with a Mrs. Adams. And he got a job in the Belfast shipyard, because at this time they were taking Catholics in. This was before there was an overwhelming Protestant population, and you see, Catholics never were much employed in Belfast. That's why those 3 boys had to depend, the 3 sons of Granny Stewart, although they drank a lot, but I think that was frustration really. There just wasn't work for Catholics. But at this time, by the time this Philip Doherty came on the scene, or Phil Doherty as he was known, which was my grandfather, he came to lodge with a Mrs. Adams, and Granny Stewart set about making a match for this Philip Doherty with her daughter Rose Stewart. And because she did it, she worked it. But the only thing is, he was 10 years older than Rose. And a Mrs. Hughes told me when I was very young, and my mother told my mother more than me, I was just listening, and it was told often enough that when she walked up the aisle, when Rose walked up the aisle of St. Patrick's, the tears, her eyes were red from crying and sleeplessness the night before, and the tears were streaming down her face. And she married this Philip Doherty, and this Philip Doherty gave her one hell of a bloody life. He was very bad to her, a very cruel man, which, mind you, wasn't just his prerogative. It was the end thing. Men in those days were very cruel to women as a rule. I think they wanted to be masterful, but he was extremely hard on her. In actual fact, my father talks about it. He actually kicked a 6 months pregnancy out of her. The child was born out in the yard. It's a big pig yard they had. I'll come to that later. So, and she was a hard-working, very fond of life, very fond of fun-loving, beautiful singer, beautiful singer, and loved to dance and sing, and loved to laugh above anything, whereas he was very sober sort of man, humourless, not entirely, would have, well, by comparative, but relatively speaking, where Rose was fun-loving, he was the opposite. So they got married. At first they lived in the Falls Road, where my father was born in the Falls Road, and he was always very ashamed of that. He never talked about it, but he was there till he was 4 years old. And his eldest sister Rachel was born there. Oh, maybe I should go back now to Granny Stewart. You heard me mention those 3 sons. Well, this is all I can remember of the 13. There was Ellen Kelly. She married a man called Kelly, and they were very happy. Ellen was a very quiet, placid kind of person. She didn't live too far from my granny. And then there was another one, and I think her name was Lizzie. I'm not quite sure. She was a big woman. And then there was one called Dolores, but that wasn't her real name. Her real Christian name, she took that name when she married Ireland's King of the Gypsies. And she never was talked about much because I think she gave up her faith and took on the Romany faith, whatever that was. But she did very well. She lived in a grand big house in a very posh area of Belfast, and also had a grand house down in Dublin. But he was quite famous and very wealthy. It was the time of the motor cars, and he was into selling cars. So that's that line. They're my greats. She would have been my great aunt, or grand aunt. So now we'll jump forward, where my father, when Rose Stewart and Phil Doherty married, they went to live in the Falls Road in some house. You see, in those days people didn't buy houses, they were all rented, except the very, very well-to-do. They bought houses, but most of the houses were rented. People, you would have had wealthy people build houses as an investment, and then people put folk into them for